Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vicky Wilkins, Dean of the School of Public Affairs here at American University. I'm pleased to introduce today's event, which I expect will be a spirited debate on whether the federal minimum wage needs to be raised. This topic speaks to the heart of who we are as an institution and how we train our students to consider challenging questions. Events like this are an expression of SPA's values in action, a chance to elevate public discourse and drive progress on critical policies. We are fortunate to count among our faculty scholars Erdal Tekin, editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Policy Analysis and Management, who offers insights to shape stronger policies across a variety of fields through their research and to work to translate that research into the broader audience. I'm also pleased to host this event because it provides us an opportunity to celebrate our relationships that we have with JPAM and Mathematica. Building and maintaining these connections are essential to our school, our faculty, and our students. I'm thankful to have such strong partnerships with these two amazing organizations and for their leadership. My gratitude to Tara and Paul. So welcome and thank you again for joining us. I will now turn it over to Erdal to introduce the rest of the program.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you very much. And hi, everyone. Welcome to our webinar. Today's event is jointly organized by the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, Mathematica, School of Public Affairs at American University, and the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. My name is Erdal Tekin, and I'm a professor in the School of Public Affairs at American University. I am also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. JPAM is the official publication of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, and it is housed at the School of Public Affairs at American University. This year marks the 40th anniversary of JPAM. Over those 4 decades, the journal has established itself as the premier venue for disseminating innovative and empirically rigorous research that meets the highest standards of scholarship across disciplines and policy domains. Based on the impact factor, the journal is consistently ranked among the highest in economics and public administration fields. One of the unique features of the journal is its point-counterpoint section, in which we invite scholars for a debate on policy topics that are important and timely. Earlier this year, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 was introduced to raise the federal minimum wage in annual increments to $15 per hour by June 2025. However, experts have disagreed on if and how an increase of this magnitude should be put into place. This event will include a discussion with 2 experts with differing views on this subject, who shared their views in the JPAM's most recent point-counterpoint column, which will appear in the 4th issue of Volume 40. Now it's my honor to introduce our distinguished panel. Our moderator is Paul Decker. Paul is the president and CEO of Mathematica and a nationally recognized expert in policy research, data analytics, education, and labor policy. For over 3 decades, Paul has been working to improve public well-being through the use of evidence. Since becoming president and CEO of Mathematica in 2007, Paul has led the expansion and diversification of Mathematica's work into new and evolving areas while maintaining its long-standing commitment to rigorous and objective analysis. He is also the associate editor for JPAM, a past president of the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, a trustee of the Committee for Economic Development, and chairs the Government Relations Committee of CEO Connection. Our 2 panelists are Michael Reich and Michael Strain. Michael Reich is a professor of economics and chair of the Center on Wage and Employment Dynamics at the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment of the University of California at Berkeley. He served as the director of the center from 2004 to 2015. Dr. Reich received his PhD in economics from Harvard University. His research publications cover numerous topics of labor economics and political economy, including the economics of racial inequality, the analysis of labor market segmentation, historical stages in the US labor markets and social structures of accumulation, high-performance workplaces, union management cooperation, Japanese labor management systems, and living wages and minimum wages. Our other panelist, Michael Strain, is the Director of Economic Policy Studies and Arthur Burns Scholar in Political Economy at the American Enterprise Institute. He is the author of the recently published book, The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It, which examines longer-term economic outcomes for workers and households. An economist, his research has been published in academic journals and in policy journals, and he has edited 2 books on economics and public policy. Dr. Strain also writes frequently for popular audiences. His essays and op-eds have been published by the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. He is also a columnist for Bloomberg Opinion. He is frequently interviewed by major media outlets, speaks often to a variety of audiences, and has testified before Congress. Before joining American Enterprise Institute, Dr. Strain worked at the US Census Bureau and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. He holds a PhD from Cornell University. Without further ado, I want to offer the microphone to Paul Decker, who is going to moderate our webinar today. Paul.
Thank you, Erdal, and thank you to AU and to the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management for co-sponsoring this event with Mathematica. For folks in the audience, I'm sure you'll have questions during the course of our discussion, and I urge you to submit those questions in the Q&A function. We're going to have about 30 minutes at the end of this session to answer questions that come in from the audience. And just in case there's any confusion, the chat function won't work for communicating questions. You have to use the Q&A function for this webinar. Turning to our discussion, I want to thank both of you, Michael and Michael, for participating in JPAM's Point Counterpoint column. It was a lot of fun in terms of the process, and you both are recognized as national experts on this issue. And in fact, you've both participated together in recent congressional hearings on raising the federal minimum wage. So we're grateful for your insights, both in the column as well as during the webinar today. So I wanted to start out the discussion by spending a few minutes stepping back and reflecting on the evolving thinking around the federal minimum wage. As you and many of our attendees likely know, David Card recently received the Nobel Prize for his empirical contributions to labor economics. His work on the minimum wage in the early 1990s with my late friend and neighbor, Alan Krueger, immediately comes to mind as an example of those empirical contributions. And I'm interested to hear your thoughts on how you feel Card and Krueger's work and related research has influenced our thinking on minimum wage in recent years. Michael Reich, can you get us started, please?
Thank you, Paul. Yes, I happened to be in Europe when the Nobel Prize in Economics was announced. I was literally on the edge of my chair, excited to hear that David Card, as well as Josh Angress and Vito Imbens had been awarded the prize. In David's case, it was not just for the empirical methods, which are outstanding and which he is kind of head and shoulders of everybody, but also for the content, particularly the minimum wage studies that he did in the early 1990s, which were explicitly cited by the Nobel Prize Committee in their detailed statement, as well as in the presentation they made. So this is, I think, a great validation of the work that he began in the early 1990s when New Jersey raised its minimum wage, but neighboring Pennsylvania did not. He and Alan Krueger, as you mentioned, collected data from fast food restaurant chains, identical chains on either side of the Pennsylvania and New Jersey border, all on either the Pennsylvania Turnpike or the Jersey Pike. There's really no differentiation when you drive there. It's just a state border, but with a different minimum wage. And they had the idea to not only look pre and post to collect data on employment as well as wages, but particularly employment in each of these restaurants before and after the New Jersey minimum wage increase, but also to compare the differences in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And this gave rise to the concept of a difference in difference study. It was really the first one. And that now has just swept the profession, not only in microeconomics, but increasingly in macroeconomics as well. So, of course, Krueger's work at the time was controversial. And later studies, including some that I did and that are cited in the Nobel report, found that their case study, with just one pre and one post evidence point, actually held up when you looked at all the different state borders where there were minimum wage differences over a 16-year period. So the economics profession, half of it at first, well, before that, 90% of economists said the minimum wage would reduce employment. After that, it became split. And then increasingly with the additional research I was just citing, the profession has become closer to like 80 or 90%, thinking that even a $15 minimum wage phased in over time would not hurt employment. That's borne out by a number of surveys. I don't really have time to get into the weeds on that, but I think that there is, of course, still a dissenting view that Michael Strain might talk about, but I think this is now the consensus. And it has affected economic policy. I myself have been consulted by Republican lawmakers in New York State and by testified at hearings, not just in Congress, but also in Sacramento, at the California legislature, and in numerous cities. So I have seen this on the ground.
Thank you, Michael. It's great to recognize the influence of somebody's work in such an important area. Michael Strain, I think you really have in mind what Michael Reich described when you talk about the modern approach in terms of the methodology. Do you have anything to add regarding the evolution in thinking around minimum wage?
No, I don't really. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a more deserving economist for the Nobel Prize than David Card. I'm biased given that one of my main research fields is labor economics, but I think that David is a giant and really has reshaped the way that we understand labor markets and the way that we study them. And of course, Josh Angrist and Guido Imbens have been tremendously important in developing a lot of the tools that labor economists use. And so, this was one of my favorite Nobel Prizes in a long time. And my research is in this area, so that may be a little colored, but I was in a very good mood when I woke up and saw the news, and that lasted for some time. I mean, if you want to talk about the influence of David's work with Alan Krueger on the minimum wage, one of my favorite New York Times editorial board editorials was published on January 14th, 1987. And the headline of the editorial is "The Right Minimum Wage, $0.00." And the editors of the New York Times wrote, this was when the minimum wage was $3.35 an hour. And the editors wrote that there's a virtual consensus among economists that the minimum wage is an idea whose time has passed. And I think that the editorial board was accurately summarizing the way that economists in the late 80s thought about the minimum wage. And David and Alan completely overturned that and have launched, I think, a really fruitful literature trying to understand both the effects of minimum wages on a variety of outcomes, including employment, but also using the minimum wage as a way to understand broader questions about how the labor market works. And I think that those two developments have each been extremely important for economics. They've been extremely important for public policy, and they're why they're, in a very real sense, that they're why we're here today.
Great. So let's move from thinking about the general evolution of thinking on minimum wage to your specific insights. The framing of our column was around raising the federal minimum wage to $15 per hour over the course of 5 years, as Erdal referred to before. At the time, the Raise the Wage Act of 2021 had been introduced, and it called for this type of increase. And I think it might be helpful for our audience to discuss where things currently stand in terms of the minimum wage and what an increase of this magnitude would represent. Michael Reich, could you give us a sense of how much of an outlier the current real minimum wage is compared to historical minimums?
It's very much an outlier. In terms of current dollars, the peak minimum wage in the United States, I'm sorry, constant dollars, was in the late 1960s, and it would be about the equivalent of around $11 or more today. And the minimum wage itself has declined in real terms since 2007, when it was set at $7.25 federally. And so it's quite a bit lower than that today in real terms. And it's the longest period where we have not had an increase in the minimum wage, which used to happen periodically to keep up with the median wage or with the cost of living. So when we evaluate going to $15, we have to keep in mind the long period in which has not been increased, and not to say, oh, it's $7.25 to $15. That sounds like a lot. So how big of an increase is it? Well, we've had other increases of this magnitude before. It's the main thing to mention here is that the act that's proposed and it was passed by the House, and which the Democratic Party has endorsed, would be phased. The minimum wage would be phased in over 5 years, and that means we're on an annual basis. The increase is not so great. The second point I'd make is that precisely because the federal minimum wage is not increased, many states have raised their minimum wages. I can't remember the exact number. I think it's around 26 or something now, or 27, maybe it's 30. And 10 have gone, or in the process of going up to $15. That includes, by the way, a relatively low wage red state like Florida. And excuse me, the other thing to keep in mind is that the minimum wage is not the effective binding wage in practically anywhere. Hardly anyone is getting the minimum wage precisely because it hasn't increased. And so if you look at low wage areas of low wage states and the low wage occupations, unskilled occupations like fast food cook or a server in a restaurant, we're already seeing the effective entry wage at around $9 or more in most of these states. And that's even before the current pandemic effects on the labor market, which have raised the entry wage, especially in restaurants, much greater than in other industries. So we're getting close to like $10 as the effective wage. So an increase to $15 is actually doesn't sound quite so big when you put it in those terms. Now the critics will also say, well, yeah, but this is outside the range of previous experience. And to that, I would say, well, policy always involves going outside the range of previous experience. That's not unusual here. Otherwise, we would never have had a minimum wage. And in fact, there's quite a lot of variation in the ratio of the minimum wage to the median wage at the county level. And the minimum wage relative to the median wage at the state level, if it were $15, would get up to about 80% as a ratio, which sounds really scary, but we already have lots of counties that are already at that ratio, even in the 725 states, because their wages are so low. And when I studied the effects in those very low wage counties, I could not find a disemployment effect. And that's also true of the best studies that have looked at this using state and federal data. So to me, it seems like there is some evidence saying, well, we could absorb this. And I'll save some of my comments for later, but I think there are other, the Econ 1 approach that we teach our students is that if the price of something goes up, the quantity demanded is going to go down. What could be wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with it is that it assumes that everything else is constant. And that isn't the case, because firms actually would prefer to raise their prices a little bit, absorb the cost of the minimum wage in the industries where it has an impact, and sell more burgers rather than lay off their workers. And I think that's where a lot of the research evidence has gone.
Okay, and we'll come back to some of those issues
Mhm.
in the course of our discussion. Michael Strain, what do you think? $15 per hour is the target. Is that a big number?
Well, yes. I think it's a very big number. I think many of Michael's points are well taken. But when you look to see one way to kind of quantify how big is big is to look at the ratio of the minimum wage to the median wage in a given state. And it used to be thought that you'd want that to be around 50%. So you'd want the minimum wage to be around 1/2 of the median wage. Common to hear that 60% was high. If your minimum wage is kind of pushing up on that 60% range, then that's thought to be high. If you look at the OECD, if you look at a group of major developed economies, you see there that the minimum wage is about 54% of the median wage, and that many of those countries have, or several of them at least have, the minimum wage below 50, below 1/2. Countries like Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Australia, Canada, Israel, Spain, the United Kingdom, and that's kind of where some of the international evidence on how high can you push this comes from. To try and get a handle on 15 and really quantify it, in the paper that I wrote for JPAM, I did a simple projection of state median wages to 5 years from now, when the Raise the Wage Act would be in effect, and I found that 32 states would have a ratio of the minimum wage to the state median that's above 2/3. Remember, the kind of conventional rule of thumb is 1/2. 60% was considered high. In 32 states, the ratio was 2/3. In 14 states, the ratio I projected was over 3/4. These states are many of them are in the South: Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi are among them. Not only in the South, New Mexico's in that group, South Dakota's in that group, Idaho's in that group. These are lower wage states, and I think it's unlikely that if the minimum wage is above 75% of the median wage, that you're not going to see some troubling labor market effects from that. So yes, I think Michael's absolutely right that entry wages are often higher than the minimum wage. I think Michael's right that there's a lot of variance across counties in terms of what the kind of effective lower wage is. But 15 is so high that for a good number of states, maybe as many as 30, certainly I think as many as 15, that's gonna really be disruptive in a way that I think is gonna harm lower wage workers.
So that picture looks very different in different states.
It looks very different in different states.
Mm-hmm. Well, all three of us are economists. So I think we would all agree, as any economist would, that any policy move like this is likely to have at least potential costs and benefits. And Michael Strain, you framed your initial essay for the column around the recognition that there are both benefits and costs associated with the minimum wage. And so for most of the rest of our discussion, I want to focus on those benefits and costs, starting first with the benefits of the minimum wage. Michael Strain, in your essay, you identify key benefits of increasing the minimum wage to the proposed level of $15 an hour. And you ultimately conclude that the costs of making that change outweigh the benefits. But I'm hoping you could first speak to what you see as the benefits of the proposed increase. Who are the main beneficiaries of that increase? And how do these benefits relate to what you see as the primary purpose of the federal minimum wage?
Yeah, absolutely. And before diving into the specifics, I mean, I do think that this is the right way to think about this. And I think it's the right way to think about, nearly any policy change, that when Congress changes the law, that's going to make some people better off. It's going to make some people worse off. It's going to make some things better, some things worse. The value that economists can provide as economists is in trying to figure out what the effects of any policy change will be, the bad effects and the good effects, to try and quantify those effects. But whether or not the costs outweigh the benefits or the benefits outweigh the costs is often really a normative question. It's a question of your own political philosophy, of normative views, of moral and ethical considerations. And that's where I think it's harder for economists as economists to weigh in. Of course, economists are also human beings and citizens in the democracy and have views on these issues. I certainly do. The minimum wage debate, I think, often ignores this, and there are opponents of higher minimum wages that present this policy as if it's all downside, and I think that's nonsense. Supporters of the policy often present it as if it's all upside, and I think that's also mistaken as well. So I think you're right to ask about the benefits. I think they would be considerable. I mean, the Congressional Budget Office did a study of $15 an hour, and they found that about 17 million workers would be directly affected and would see their earnings increase. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's millions and millions and millions of households that are going to see a significant boost in their earnings. The Congressional Budget Office also found that that the higher minimum wage would reduce poverty, which is particularly important as well. And so I think this certainly would have some considerable benefits.
Michael Reich, I'd like you to weigh in on the benefits as well. And ultimately, you conclude that the benefits of a minimum wage increase outweigh the costs. In terms of the benefits, you specifically discuss some benefits that some of us might think of as downstream effects, like health and criminal recidivism. And those are important, even if they are downstream. Could you please elaborate on our discussion, adding to Michael Strain's thoughts, and share what you see as the key benefits and who are the main beneficiaries?
Sure. I think Michael introduced the topic of the benefits very nicely. A lot of it could be summarized by the decline in poverty, especially in childhood poverty. And we know from a large and growing literature that poor families, low-income families who are having trouble keep making their ends meet, many of whom are above the level of the official poverty line, that they are in a state often of dire kind of multiple crises. They might have a job, but their kid is sick and they can't go to daycare, or the daycare provider is sick, or their car breaks down, or they're having a fight with their spouse, or the bus is late. There's so many different things that they're all trying to do to get through that month. And there's nothing like a raise in the minimum wage to calm things down a bit for those families, which leads to much better outcomes for the children. This is well documented now in so many studies of the kind of excess stress, let me say stress today, on these families. And so there's a large literature now, not all of it that I think is methodologically convincing, But of the ones that are convincing, there's quite a large literature that shows there are many positive direct health benefits on things like reducing obesity, on cigarette smoking, and also on increasing education levels among the kids. And I myself have done a study that shows, published in Journal of Health Economics, that shows that minimum wage increases reduce suicides by a very large number, precisely because when people are having these crises, they're really doubting themselves, and even the incidence of major depressive episodes goes down quite a bit. And what could be more moving than to recognize that you're not just increasing the standard of living of so many people, but that it's having this kind of concrete effect on the adults and on the kids. In terms of who gets the benefits, maybe 10% of minimum wage workers now are teens. The prototypical minimum wage worker of the 1960s and 70s. The median minimum wage worker, that's someone who's affected by growth, increase in the minimum wage, is typically well over 20, often in their 30s, and works at a fast food restaurant and supports 1 or 2 kids, and has worked in that industry for quite some time. So it's a career. It's not a question of anymore of the benefits of the minimum wage being, well, it creates good work habits in teens and so on. Or that an increase in the minimum wage, rather, if it reduces teen employment, hurts that group. The benefits also are concentrated among Black workers and Hispanic, Latino workers, but they raise wages for all workers who are at the bottom, white or Black, and so that I think are huge benefits.
So I'm just kind of scribbling down an inventory of all the things that the two of you mentioned.
Yeah.
And it gives you a good sense of why minimum wage is a viable policy. We, in the course of your discussion, you mentioned the minimum wage. An increase in the minimum wage can increase earnings for 17 million households. It can reduce childhood poverty. It can enhance child outcomes, and it can increase health. And it can increase mental health, and it has a positive impact on workers, including on their careers, and a positive impact for low-wage workers. So there's a long list of benefits that we were able to identify in our discussion. But of course, there has to be another side to this too, which is the cost. So let's flip over to the other side, which is really where the two of your essays focus most intensively in the column, and that's the cost of raising the minimum wage. You have very different views on what you feel the magnitudes of those costs are, specifically on, when it comes to the impacts on employment levels. And I'd like each of you to share your thoughts on how an increase of this magnitude, raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, might affect employment levels based on the evidence as you read it. Michael Reich, can you address that first, please?
Yes, you are right. This is the most studied part of minimum wage economics research literature, probably 90% of the discussion, and almost all the policy commentary is about the employment effects, particularly in the past, as I said, on teens. And we've made a lot of progress since Krueger found that there was no impact of the minimum wage on fast food employment, because we now have much better data. We have panel data that covers long periods of time. We can look at leads and lag, anticipated effects of minimum wages, lagged effects up to 7 years after the minimum wage. We have so many minimum wage events now at the state and also the local level, and a few at the federal level, that we have a really good database for evaluating the effects of the minimum wage, and also, as Michael Strain mentioned, for better understanding the dynamics of the low-wage labor market. And the key advance, besides having more data and more events, really comes from the work that was honored in the Nobel Prize, which is that if you want to make a causal identification as opposed to a correlation, you need to be careful of a number of methodological issues. And I don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but they're important to point out, and I see them in JPAM in all the articles anyway. So one is you want to make sure that there is actually what we call a first stage effect on earnings. And that is to say, if you're studying a group, you want to make sure that the minimum wage actually increased wages in that group. And that sounds elementary, but I would say that well over half of the studies that I have read, and I've read practically all of them, that there are, do not make this first stage identification. And so we don't really know whether the effect that they're pointing to, whether it's positive or negative, is a result of the minimum wage if we don't have a treatment effect. The second thing is that what the difference in difference method is really is a treatment versus control. Just like in medical studies, or when I was in the 4th grade in science class, and you put iron filings on a piece of paper, and underneath you move the magnet, and the iron filings move. But if you put something else, paper on shreds on top of the paper, they don't move. I mean, that's, this is basically not that different. You want to make sure that the treatment and control groups are identical as much as possible, because we can't randomize who gets the minimum wage. And to do that, we have a couple of important checks, all of which were noted in the Nobel Prize. One is you want to make sure there are no pre-trend differences, meaning pre-trend meaning pre the event. So if minimum wage, if teen employment, say, was trending down more in minimum wage states, higher minimum wage states, before the minimum wage events took place, that tells you that comparing minimum wage and state minimum wage states and 725 states isn't going to give you a clean comparison, because there are other things going on unrelated to the minimum wage. And that's something that we discovered, my colleagues and I, about a decade ago, and both for restaurant employment and the study of teen employment, that the prior research claiming negative effects was just not understanding or recognizing that there were these negative pre-trends. In other words, the states that increased minimum wages are not random. They have other attributes that you want to control for. That's the most important, looking for the first stage effect and the pre-trends. You also want to do make sure that your policy evaluation doesn't show effects in high wage industries like finance or business consulting, and that it has more effects where you'd expect to find it, like in restaurants, which has the highest proportion of minimum wage workers. And and there's other so-called placebo studies that you want to conduct, and so forth. And my reading of the literature is that some of this research does not at all meet these standards, which has been called the credibility standards of the credibility revolution. They're not credible because they don't test for pre-trends and don't have these other tests in them either. And that the best studies have been recognized. And I point out in the JPAM column to a paper that came out a year or two ago in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, which is a top-rated journal, which was, I know personally, because I know the authors, it went through about 5 revisions and made 5 or 6 referees. It was a very rigorous process. And that article has now become the industry standard, the methods in that article, where they compare what happens just below the minimum wage, just above the minimum wage. That they use these bins to look throughout the wage distribution to make sure there are no wage increases where there shouldn't be, where you shouldn't expect to find them. And this is in articles that I've submitted since to academic journals. I'm constantly told, well, you have to use that method because that's the industry standard now. And I think that's what divides the literature that finds very small or no negative employment effects to those that do find negative employment effects, is how much care goes into that. It's not the number of studies, but the quality of those studies. The second point I'd make about, besides the methodology and the implications of it, is that when we talk about declining employment effects, we're not saying that a worker who loses a job is condemned to unemployment for the rest of the year or the rest of their life. In the low-wage labor markets, people are moving in and out of jobs all the time. And they may be out because an employer said, oh, I have to cut back, but they may be out for just a couple of weeks more than they would otherwise. And over the course of the year, what we really want to compare is, was the increase in their pay because of the minimum wage greater or less than the decline in the number of hours they worked annually? So we don't have a binary distinction here between employment and unemployment. We recognize these ins and outs. And when you, especially when you do that, I think you kind of see, well, okay, this is really a situation where the benefits do outweigh the costs, but both from the more sophisticated, credible studies, and also from this point about the employment, just reducing the number of hours per year by some amount.
To take your first point, Michael, let me see if I can just kind of think about it in simplistic terms. What I hear you saying is that there may be a variety of employment effects that are identified in a series of studies, but these methods can be subject to bias. And if we filter the studies based on the degree to which you think the methodology has successfully addressed the bias, once we filter the studies that you think are weaker out, we're left with studies that largely show a small or zero employment effect. Does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right. And in a paper I published in the Review of Economics and Statistics in 2010, we compared the results of Newmark and Washer's studies who were looking at restaurant employment, finding negative effects. Or rather, we displayed and showed that there were big pre-trends, negative pre-trends in their data. And then when we controlled for those, we found still wage effects, but no employment effects.
I see.
Significant employment effects.
So you actually looked directly at the data and found that.
Yeah, I'm talking about empirical, all this, everything I've said is based on empirical work by myself or other people.
Yeah. Michael Strain, what's your thinking on employment effects and other potential costs of raising the minimum wage?
Well, I think Michael is right that you really want to take care to make sure that you're estimating what you think you're estimating, and so making sure that you're adequately controlling for pre-trends, or making sure that your treatment and control groups are on similar pre-trends is of paramount importance, as are a number of other things to look at. And I think he's also right that not every paper does those things. And so I think that's an important point to make for sure. When I look at the literature, I see a number of papers that do really go out of their way to make sure that they're controlling for the right things, and to make sure that they're estimating what they claim to be estimating, that find substantial disemployment effects of minimum wages. And I also find a number of papers that don't. And to figure out why different high quality studies come to different conclusions, you've really got to kind of dig into the papers in great detail. And that's where I think a lot of the exciting work is currently being done. So I agree with Michael on the importance of using the best methods. I just don't share his view that the totality of papers that do use appropriate and cutting edge methods find negligible employment effects. I think you find papers with both conclusions in that group. That's also what the Congressional Budget Office finds as well. They took a look at the literature and tried to sort through it as they do kind of in their role as trying to present consensus views among economists, and they find that there's a range of employment effects across studies, and when they try and figure out in their view what would the consensus be, they find well over 1 million jobs would be lost by going up to 15, because of the studies that they use. Not all of them, but certainly some of them do find substantial employment losses from large minimum wage increases. In my own work, I've tried to come to make some progress reconciling some of these disparate findings. And so the paper that Michael mentioned that just came out in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, I think 2 years ago, extremely important paper, very well done for sure, finds negligible employment effects from minimum wage increases. They look at, I think, 138 increases in the minimum wage in the United States. And when you actually look at the average size of the minimum wage increases they study, it's not very big. And the reason for that, of course, is that typical minimum wage increases in the United States are pretty modest. So one of the things that I've done is try to estimate whether there are nonlinearities in the effect of the minimum wage on employment. Do large increases in the minimum wage have a bigger effect on employment than small increases that isn't one for one? So if a small minimum wage increase reduces employment by X, does a large minimum wage increase reduce it by more than 2X? Let's say. And what I find is that when you look at small increases, you don't see evidence of substantial employment losses. But when you look at large increases, you do. And so, I think this is actually consistent. I think this finding is consistent with the research that Michael thinks is the most compelling. I just think it adds some nuance to that research, and that nuance is, I think, directly applicable to the question of whether Congress should raise the federal minimum wage to 50, because that would be a very large increase. So I think that the Congressional Budget Office is likely overestimating the employment losses from a $9 or $10 an hour minimum wage, underestimating the employment losses from a $12 an hour minimum wage, and also underestimating the employment losses that would come from a $15 an hour minimum wage.
Michael, Reich, what you're thinking
yeah,
about
I want to jump in here.
Go ahead.
Some of this does get into the weeds. First of all, there are quite a few of us who, despite the prestige of the Congressional Budget Office, and even though we spoke to the economists there, I met with them, and I know my colleague Aaron DeBay reviewed some of the draft reports. We just found their analysis very, very uncompelling, and they really picked out a few studies that were outliers in the data. I mean, in the research literature, for example, one from the University of Washington, where the researchers thought that a large minimum wage increase created, or found a large minimum wage increase created large negative employment effects. Those researchers have, eaten those words. I mean, in subsequent analysis they've done, they don't find such effects. And so I think the CBO, which does not do its own research, kind of arbitrarily picked studies which overweighted these outlier studies, which have been critiqued very heavily by the rest of the economics profession. I'm not going to get into why they might have done that, but now on the question, the very good question that Michael raises about small versus large, and again, I don't want to get too much into the weeds. This is in his work with Jeff Clemens, that they identify small and large as actually pretty close to each other. One's 27%, the other's 37%. It's hard to believe that there's some nonlinearities that apply at 37% increase. But I would emphasize again that what you want to look at is the ratio, as Michael said earlier, to the median wage. How large is it? In the QJE, the Quarterly Journal of Economics Literature study, the minimum wages go up to 59% of the median wage. So, and they don't find any effects when they do look at the larger, just at the larger increases. It's not the case that they're looking at the average. They're also looking for heterogeneity by the size of the minimum wage. And a paper I published last year with Anna Godoy, as I mentioned at the beginning, we looked at county data to dig even deeper below the state level. And we had a whole lot of counties where the minimum wage relative to median wage was already 80%. And we could not find negative effects even at that level. So I think, and I think we do a better job. The Clemens and Strain papers really aren't very transparent about how they treat pre-treatment effects and things like that. But again, that's getting into the weeds. The other point I'd like to make here is I think that, or I don't think it's the case that minimum wages mainly affect workers and businesses in a small number of industries. Restaurants the most, retail next, for example. And beyond those, like in a doctor's office or someone else who hires a few minimum wage workers, it's not going to have a minimum wage increase. Isn't going to have a big effect on their costs as a percent of their overall costs. If you look at restaurants, and there have been some very good studies done by the Boston Fed and Jonathan Parker of MIT, you find that prices go up in restaurants by the exact amount or nearly the exact amount that the costs go up. And the cost, so if we're talking about, say, a 10% increase in the minimum wage, then not everybody gets a 10% increase because there are already quite a few people who are closer to the minimum wage, not right, all bunched at the old minimum wage. And then labor costs are only a third of overall costs. And there's some offset because productivity goes up and turnover goes down and so on. When you do that calculation, it looks like about costs go up maybe a couple of percent overall, and prices fully adapt. And I've done an additional study showing this. And I think that makes sense. Employers, when they're surveyed, they say, well, what are you going to do? The first thing they say is, well, we'll raise our prices. It's only the second they say, oh, we're going to cut employment. But they would much prefer to raise their prices a little bit. So Chipotle recently announced it was going to have a $15 minimum wage, and it was going to raise its prices by 4% to accommodate that. McDonald's has a minimum wage policy and said, well, it was going to, and other costs are going up, so it's going to raise its prices by 6% for all those cost increases. So you see this in actual examples. I was recently in rural Oregon visiting my daughter, and in a city of 5,000 people, I saw a big billboard, help wanted, $14 an hour in a very low wage area, as low as there is in the South. This was for McDonald's job. So, so I think there are costs, and the costs are mainly borne by people who eat in restaurants and a little bit by people who go to retail, but they're very manageable. The price elasticity of demand in restaurants, according to the Department of Agriculture's Economic Research Service, suggests that prices don't really respond that much. Prices in fast food or limited service restaurant, full service restaurants are pretty inelastic. 4% increase in prices does not really reduce demand so much. So in fact, employers are actually better off in terms of sales and profits if they raise their prices a little bit. Their sales don't actually dip anywhere by the amount that the price goes up.
We're getting a lot of questions coming in through the Q&A function. So Michael Strain, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to Michael Reich's comments, refinements around the employment effects and the potential costs. And then I'd like to begin to get to some of the audience questions.
I think he and I disagree on the CBO report. it strikes me as a pretty good characterization of the state of the literature. And I think it reflects the fact that there are some very high quality studies that, and Michael's mentioned some that don't find employment losses from minimum wage increases, and there are some that do. And it's a tough literature. A lot
Michael,
of times,
if we took the CBO estimate as the right number, how do I think about the magnitude of that number?
well, one way to think about the magnitude is the size of the employment losses, which I think they estimated at around 1.5 million jobs by 2028, and I think it was 1.6 million by 2031. So that's big. I think that's big. Again, I think it would be bigger than that, but I think their estimates are large. I think Michael and I also disagree on the evidence from Seattle. Again, because this is such a large minimum wage increase, there aren't that many, places you can look to really directly study it. And one of the places you can look is Seattle, and there they found substantial labor supply reductions. I don't agree that they had to retract that in any sense. And I think they, in a subsequent paper, they refined it and added some nuance to it. But I don't think that they had to walk back their finding of substantial labor supply reductions. I agree with Michael that that there are many things firms can do to absorb a minimum wage increase, and there are many things they can do besides reduce the size of their workforce. It's a complicated issue. Certainly they can raise prices. I agree with Michael that there's very good evidence that firms raise prices in the face of a minimum wage increase, and if they can adequately raise prices, then that may mitigate the need to reduce employment. The minimum wage also probably to some extent pays for itself in terms of reducing turnover costs and reducing hiring costs and recruiting costs, because workers want to stick around for longer because wages are higher. That's another way that firms can absorb the cost of minimum wage increases. There's some evidence that the costs of minimum wage increases are really borne not by continuing firms, but by exit and entry. That the minimum wage goes up, existing firms figure out how to deal with it, but firms that enter the labor market structure their workforces differently than they otherwise would have with fewer employees. And so over time, you end up with a smaller workforce, even if continuing firms are able to absorb the increase in that way. Another way that firms absorb a minimum wage increase is by changing the types of workers they hire. And so it may be a lot harder for a high school dropout to get a job because firms now want to hire high school graduates because they're going to be more productive. That wouldn't show up as a change in the level of employment, but that would concentrate the costs of the increase on the least skilled, least experienced workers in the workforce. And in my view, all these things happen. But I think that when you're talking about taking the minimum wage up to $15 an hour, which again would be 2/3, 75% of the median wage in over a dozen states, I think firms are not going to be able to avoid reducing employment. If you're a firm in Alabama, if you're a firm in Arkansas, if you're a firm in Mississippi, if you're a firm in Louisiana, if you're a firm in South Carolina, there's only so much you can raise your prices there's only so much you can substitute toward more educated workers and away from lesser educated workers. You know, there's only so much you're going to save on reduced turnover, et cetera, et cetera. When you're talking about a minimum wage increase of that magnitude, I don't see how those other margins of adjustment can adequately compensate. I think reducing employment is inevitable, especially in those lower wage states.
Let me follow up on those remarks with a couple of questions that came in from the audience, because a couple of these are focused on other employer responses. First question is, much of the conversation has been around employment effects on jobs. However, one of our audience members asked if there is any evidence around employment effects on hours. Somewhat similarly, another audience member asked if the workers losing their jobs by a raise to $15 an hour, like the CBO estimated, could be explained by some workers who work multiple low-wage jobs, quitting them, and then just holding one job. So what about those kinds of responses? Hours, or people who hold multiple jobs going back to one job?
Should I go first, or do you want Michael Strain to go first?
Michael Reich, why don't you go first?
All right. Yeah, we do have data on hours, and I think Michael Strain and I might disagree on what the data show, but my read, again, of the best studies is there are no quantitatively important or statistically significant effects on hours. And it is a little surprising, because you think employers would cut back on hours, but they have already cut back well before a minimum wage increase. They're already optimizing. Multiple low-wage jobs, that's a very good question. In fact, when I studied the San Francisco citywide minimum wage in a methodology very similar to Card and Krueger, back in 2004, the San Francisco minimum wage had gone from $6.75 to $8.50 overnight. Well, actually in 2 years, depending on the size of the employer. We found that some workers who were part-time became full-time. So yes, I think there's some of that going on, but it's very hard to find that in more, I guess, in the data, because it's just the effects are, the numbers are pretty small. But yes, it might be affecting. It could also be the case that employers are using their existing workforce more effectively by giving them some training. So, why don't you help us, get on the internet and advertise our business. A lot of employers might not be able to do that, but their young employees do, even if they only have a high school degree. And so there's a little bit of evidence for that, but again, it's not easy to find. I would say that there's also some evidence that labor supply increases after a minimum wage increase. Some rigorous evidence published in good referee journals has found that, for example, people who are about to retire, older workers, delay their retirement when the minimum wage goes up, because working is basically pays more. And then, of course, they might get higher benefits, Social Security benefits eventually. And of course, that also helps the Social Security Trust Fund quite a bit. I've done some work, again, with Anna Godoy, that's coming out in the Journal of Human Resources, that shows that when the minimum wage goes up, single mothers of young children are much more able to enter the workforce than they were before. And we think it's mainly, what we find is it's mainly because now they can afford childcare, which they could not before, some of the fixed costs of working. And that is a bigger effect in our study than what the EITC literature finds. The Earned Income Tax Credit is also kind of famous for saying, oh, well, when you increase the Earned Income Tax Credit, or you adopt a supplement at the state level, that labor supply and employment goes up, especially for women and for mothers. And we find that also for the minimum wage, and we find a bigger effect, more bang for the buck, so to speak, than the ITC, which is not, I'm not trying to be competitive, but just to give some quantitative sense of how big that is. And there's another study that finds that criminal recidivism goes down when the minimum wage goes up. Again, when you make work pay, it's, you know, a better alternative than it was before compared to engaging even in burglaries or that level of crime. And these are all very, I think, sophisticated studies. So I would argue there's a lot of positive effects.
Michael Strain, before you make any comments on the first question, I'll introduce the second question because it's again related to employer responses, and you can kind of pick and choose how you want to address them. This question is, I've seen some discussion that raising the minimum wage might cause employers to reduce benefits like health insurance, even if they don't reduce their demand for labor. What are your thoughts on this? And is the evidence convincing, or is this overblown?
I think that there's not a lot of evidence on that question. The evidence that I've seen does suggest that employers respond to minimum wage increases by reducing fringe benefits. You know, this seems reasonable to me. You know, that would be one of several ways that a business might try to absorb higher labor costs. You know, along with raising prices, along with some of the other effects that we've discussed. You know, there's no money tree, and when labor costs go up, businesses have to figure out, you know, some way to handle that, and so I think it stands to reason that some may choose to reduce the generosity of other components of a compensation package. I know we want to get to questions. One comment I would make on Michael's response to the previous question is that I agree with him that we should expect a higher minimum wage to draw some people into the workforce. And for in some of my work, I have some models that show that you know, when the minimum wage goes up by a little bit, the coefficient on that employment effect is positive, which means that the increase in the minimum wage actually leads to higher employment. I think this is very easy to understand in a very kind of simple economic model. The higher wage draws people into the workforce whose reservation wage kept them out of the workforce under the lower minimum wage regime, but who find working attractive now that the minimum wage has gone up. But the minimum wage increase is small enough that businesses don't feel the need to reduce the size of their workforces. Maybe they increase their prices, or maybe they do something else. And so you get a small positive employment effect. This seems completely reasonable to me. But just to underline the point again, for $15 an hour, that seems unlikely. I think that firms would have to turn to restructuring their workforce, particularly in lower wage states.
One of the questions that we've gotten has to do with, I guess, what you might consider second order effects. If minimum wage is increased to $15 an hour, do you anticipate that there would be ripple effects among those who are already $15 to $16 per hour? Will those companies need to increase their wages accordingly, say to $20 an hour, to maintain employee satisfaction? Michael Strain, do you want to address that one first?
I don't know about the 20, but yeah, I think there would be ripple effects, and we've seen that with previous smaller minimum wage increases as well.
Michael, Rick, what's your thinking on that? Let me talk first about the benefits question, the offsetting. Basically, this is a kind of a long debate in economics and labor economics. Are there compensating wage differentials? So if a job is dirtier, or less safe, or whatever, do workers get higher pay as a result to compensate them for taking the risks? And this has also been extended into the benefits literature, particularly on health benefits. There is a paper from 2004 finding that benefits did not go down when the minimum wage goes up. It's kind of an old paper, but it's a very well done one by Bob Kastner. Michael Strange, a little too modest. He is the author of a paper looking at the effects on benefits. Again, with Jeff Clemens, they find just a 7% decline in benefits when the minimum wage goes up by I think it was $1. And I think that might be the case because benefits are already actually very low in low-wage industries. We don't find that the low-wage industries have better non-wage conditions. They actually have worse ones. But also, more recent studies have to contend with the fact of the existence of the ACA, American Obamacare, and it's a tricky question as to what's causing any decline in employer-sponsored healthcare in a time when there are alternatives. I also want to say that there is a model out there of the firm in which labor markets in which firms have wage setting power. It's not the case that they are wage takers as in a competitive wage model. They have a lot of firms have found, do find in our studies find, that if they paid 1 penny less, say, than their competitors, their workers don't leave, which a competitive model would say happens because there's no frictions. In fact, there are a lot of frictions in the labor market, and this has been summarized under the theory of monopsony, that is where there are such frictions. And in those situations, employers can raise wages without it actually hurting their profits. So we have models where that can happen. Can it happen up to $15? I think that's an empirical question and not a logical one. On the second order effects, I totally agree. There are ripple effects, which are well known and estimated in the literature. They go up usually about 15% above the new minimum wage. They don't go all the way up like to the managers, but they have to do, especially with equity. If you're a supervisor and all of a sudden someone under you is getting paid $15 and you're going to probably get a $16 or $17 increase. But then we calculate that. I think in the numbers that Michael Strain mentioned from the CBO, because it was about 17 million who would get pay increases, which by the way is very large compared to the numbers even the CBO who lose jobs. But when you include the ripple effects, it's more like 30 million workers. And they're needy too, just because they're, they're not, their families could use the extra income.
Another question that came in has to do with thinking about the magnitude of the $15 per hour. When evaluating whether $15 an hour is a big number for the minimum wage, panelists mentioned possibly considering the ratio of minimum wage to the median wage, and a good ratio is 50 to 60%. What is the rationale for choosing the median wage as a benchmark for the minimum wage? Is the minimum wage generally considered a livable wage across all localities? Without any additional adjustments for the cost of living, I'm concerned that the median wage may not always be a livable wage. Who would like to take that one on first?
Well, first of all, I think it's a point well taken. How do you decide what counts as big and what counts as small? And simply looking at the level doesn't really tell you that. And so, trying to find some way to scale it, I think is sensible. And I think looking at median wages is a sensible way to, kind of give you, some sense of its scale. But there are other ways to do that as well. I think on the broader point though, no, I think the minimum wage is often not a wage that certainly the family could comfortably live off of, and I think that's not necessarily a problem, provided that the social safety net is generous enough to compensate for that. I think one of our goals for public policy should be that nobody who heads a household and works full time lives in poverty. The minimum wage kind of implicitly assumes that the burden or the responsibility for achieving that social goal should rest with the employers of minimum wage workers and with the customers who frequent minimum wage businesses. And that's not completely crazy by any stretch. But my concern with that model of social organization is that you end up leaving a lot of people out because you end up having to have a minimum wage that is high to the point that a lot of lower wage workers with relatively fewer skills or less experience can't really get a job. I like relying on government redistribution programs more than relying on the minimum wage to meet that social goal, in part because that allows the market to set wages, which will allow for more people to participate in the economy because the market wage is going to be lower than the minimum wage. But also because I think that all of society should share in the responsibility of making sure that people who work full-time and head a household don't live in poverty. And so a program like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which Michael mentioned earlier, that's the logic of that program. We take money from hedge fund managers and economists and from consultants and from doctors and surgeons and whoever else. We collect money from them through the tax system, and we transfer it to low-income households through a program like the EITC, in order to make sure that, again, that households that are working full-time don't live in poverty. The minimum wage lets all those other people off the hook. If it's only Walmart's responsibility and the people who shop at Walmart for higher prices, then you're kind of saying, okay, well, if you're a partner in a law firm, or if you're a heart surgeon, or if you're a well-to-do economist, then you're not going to be part of helping to fight poverty among workers. And so I think there are economic benefits from relying on earning subsidies like the EITC, but I also think it reflects, at least in my view, it reflects a preferable political philosophy.
Okay. Just scrolling here to another question. What audience member noted that they've wondered why there's so much effort placed on focusing on determining a single minimum wage value rather than trying to create a formula that targets some threshold, like 50% of some benchmark that can vary across place and adjust with inflation over time? Is there any precedent for policies like these? And what are your thoughts on such a rule that has more flexibility and changes in a more automatic way? Michael, Reich?
Well, we already have that in place. The federal minimum wage is a floor, and it does not at all preempt, the law does not preempt states and cities from going higher. Some states have prevented cities from going higher than their state level, which is, I think, a problem. We now have quite a bit of flexibility, and that's why 30 states and dozens of cities have higher minimum wages, because they already recognize the cost of living is higher in those states, in those areas. Or it could be that when you have a high median wage, you have more capacity to raise wages. Employers have more capacity to raise wages than they would otherwise. So it's a good point. I would be against any automatic kind of cutoff or anything like that, because those change over time. It was once the case that OECD countries were at 50% of the median on average, but now they're more like at 60%, and they're increasing. The Conservative government in the UK is on a path to increasing to have a minimum wage of 67% of the median throughout the UK, which is, you know, a poorer country than the US. The city of Los Angeles at $15 would be about 67% of the median wage, which is going to have a huge effect on the very large number of poor people who live in Los Angeles. So the other part of this question, though, is this, what's a livable wage? You know, what is the benchmark that we should set? And I think Michael introduced this very well by saying it's about supporting a family. I totally agree with that part of it, that it is the case, for example, that childcare has gone up faster in price than any other part of the consumer price index, except for my industry, higher education, where it's gone up even more. And so if you have a young child, even in a low wage state, you have to pay about $10,000 a year for childcare, for formal childcare. And that's a huge burden. It's more than rent is in many of the states. So when I think about what's a livable wage, and I look at the budget studies that do compare cost of living in different areas, it seems to me that there really isn't a county in the United States where you can raise a child, especially a young child, on less than $15 an hour, even when there are two earners in the household. So we have two parts to this. One is, what's the federal benchmark going to be, and what is the amount of flexibility? Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s and Winston Churchill about 20 or 30 years earlier both said that no firm should exist that does not pay a livable wage to its workers. It's not an excessive standard or burden on employers in the richest country in the world. And that's part of our value system also. I completely agree that we also need a safety net. I think the child allowance that is being considered in the Senate, or actually is already in effect, the refundable child tax credit, could help these families quite a bit. On the earned income tax credit, I have kind of mixed feelings. I think it's a very good program, except that it actually leads to wage reductions for people who are not recipients, or even those who are recipients. It doesn't just let employers lower their burden, it actually lowers the wage they have to pay because of the increase in labor supply. And that, I'm not saying this just as a theoretical point, but it's something that's been found in a number of empirical studies. And so it seems to me that we should not think of the minimum wage and the EITC or other social safety net as substitutes for one another, as is often mentioned, but as complements. So as they work better when they are together. A higher minimum wage keeps the wage from falling because of the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit does reduce somewhat the burden on employers and shifts it to taxpayers, which seems appropriate in the social contract model that Michael Strain is mentioning. And in fact, when you look at the map of where states have increased the minimum, the EITC over the federal level, it overlaps quite a bit with the states that have increased the minimum wage. So it doesn't overlap completely, but it's an indicator that public policy actually looks at the complementarities in this way too.
Well, we've come down to the end of our time. I want to thank you, Michael and Michael both, for participating in this discussion. I'm sorry to those in the audience whose questions we couldn't get to, but what questions we did have and the answers that you all provided made for a very interesting discussion. Erdal, I'll turn things back to you.
Thank you, Paul. And I would like to thank our panelists, Michael Reich and Michael Strain, for an excellent and thought-provoking debate on such an important and timely question. I also want to thank our moderator, Paul Decker, for an excellent job in setting the tone and ensuring that we have a lively and engaging conversation. I also want to thank the institutions behind this event, including School of Public Affairs at American University, Mathematica, and JPAM. Please follow them on Twitter to stay up to date about their activities and hear more about the events that they organize. Also, please follow JPAM on Twitter at JPAM_DC to stay up to date about our events and the research that we publish. I want to also express my appreciation to the staff from the organizing institutions who worked hard behind the scenes to coordinate things and make this event happen. Finally, I want to thank our audience who attended this event today. So this concludes our webinar. And again, thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.